Hello and welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and share practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Now, my guest this week is a Gen Xer who has spent her entire career working intergenerationally with teenagers, first as an English teacher in a state secondary schools, but then as in a pupil referral unit. She now works with Joe Roundtree, and you might remember Joe, who I spoke to a couple of weeks ago on episode 32 of this podcast. So with their project Anxiety Uncovered, they run workshops and have a podcast aimed at helping young people and the adults around them to better understand and manage anxiety. In this episode, we're going to be talking about working in schools in 2026, what adults can learn from the young, and a really hot topic, banning social media for youngsters, with the latest take direct from Australia. Yes, joining us live from Melbourne, Australia. Please welcome Emma Clark. Emma, lovely to chat to you.
Lovely to chat to you. I hear the weather's terrible over there at the moment. It's glorious here. I'm sorry to boast.
Yeah, it's not an attractive quality to gloat like that. I'm delighted that you're here because there's so much to cover, especially everyone's talking about the social media ban, which is great because it means it's in the conversation, but there's some really diverse views on that. And we'll come to that in a while, and we'll talk about your work in schools, and we'll talk about what you're seeing in schools today, and as a Gen Xer with Gen Z parents as well, and with Gen Z parents, Gen Z kids. It's an early in the morning here, late in the evening in Australia. So we're going to talk about that as well. So lots to cover in half an hour. But I know you've got quite an emotive story yourself. And I'm always talking about how we're framed as a generation by our upbringing. So could you start off by just telling us a little bit about that upbringing?
Sure. So I'm in Australia at the moment visiting family and also sort of retracing my roots in a way. I'm in a suburb called Williamstown at the moment, a suburb of Melbourne. And it's where I was born. It's where my grandparents used to live, where my father was born and he grew up. So I'm here on a little bit of a nostalgia trip, kind of chasing my roots. Because I'm Australian. I was born here. I'm an Australian citizen. And my story is one quite unusual. It is quite an unusual story in terms of the kind of things that framed me and made me who I am today. So I lived a very carefree life in Australia until the age of 7. By the age of 7, I had 2 siblings, aged 4 and 1. And at age 7, my parents had a catastrophic divorce. Anecdotally, I don't know of a worse one. They still don't speak today. When my mother left my father, she left him very dramatic, in that she put us on a plane and took us to the UK and didn't tell anyone she had a one-way ticket, me included. So it was a traumatic event for me because I left Australia and the life I knew very, very quickly, very suddenly and dramatically. And I had a good relationship with my father. I was settled in school. I was happy in Australia, and then it all vanished quick. And we moved to Wales. By that time, my mother's family were all in Wales. And it was the beginning of some tough few years. Those first couple of years, we had next to no money. We didn't have anywhere to live for a while. We were moving from sort of spare bedroom in someone's house to spare bedroom in someone else's house. Eventually, we found a small house in a very deprived area of Cardiff. And the local school there was one of the worst in Wales. So the solution was to send us to Welsh-speaking schools. Because, that way you could get into a decent school. Trouble was I had to learn Welsh on top of everything else. It was those years that were particularly hard for me. And in the end, quite formative. And had a lasting impact on me. Negative to begin with, but in the end, have turned out incredibly positively and have led to the work, to my whole career, but led definitely to the work I do today. So when you have a sort of upbringing like that, that's a bit catastrophic, a bit traumatizing. It does lead to mental health problems down the line. And these are, I did suffer from anxiety into my 20s and 30s. But at the beginning, it was quite high functioning anxiety, which really means that you become a bit of a workaholic. So when I was young, school kind of saved me. I was quite academic, particularly in the arts and humanities. School felt really safe compared to home that was, quite chaotic. And, we were on free school meals. We had hardly any money. I shared a bedroom with two of my sisters. We didn't have anything. If we were Victorian, we would have been chimney sweeps.
It's really interesting. You talk about, how your anxiety manifested itself, that you put all your energy into your schoolwork, where you hear other stories where people, rebel completely and actually do the opposite of that.
Yeah.
What was it, do you think, that drove you to be, to focus on your academia? I mean, I do love the fact that you recognised how school was a safe haven for you. And, you and I, having worked in schools, we've seen that a lot, haven't we? Where for a lot of people who come from very challenging backgrounds and family life, actually school is the one stable element that they have in their lives.
Absolutely. I think what helped was that I was quite academically able, maybe because I was when I was in Australia too. And I got a lot of validation from doing well at school, and it propelled me forward. There was a niggling part of me as well that thought, this is my escape from poverty. If I do well at school, I can get out of this situation. And it was knowing as well that there was no financial safety net. If I wanted to get out of being extremely working class, then I had to rely on myself to do it. Realised quite early on that school was the route. So I think, looking back through the rearview mirror, I worked and worked and worked, not just at school. I had part-time jobs as well on the side from the age of 14 or 15. I was sort of working hard to earn money on the side as well. And then my first job out of university was in Japan, and they love a workaholic in Japan. right in, working 6-day weeks and then clubbing all night at the weekends and whatever, just leathering it in Japan as well. So.
Did you recognise that age that this was a manifestation of struggling with mental health, or did you just see it as,
not at all,
this is just who I am, this is what I do, and I'm just keen to make the most of myself?
Well, like a lot of Gen Xers, boomers too, I think, the conversation around mental health just didn't exist. There wasn't a pastoral system in schools that recognised it in the 90s, and it wasn't a conversation that you had with people older than you. I think what people did was just push it down. And so I think I just pushed it down. It's only in the rearview mirror that I can recognise that it was actually high-functioning anxiety. And it's only because it's spilled later on, it became real anxiety, panic attacks, breakdown, whatever, in my 20s, that I was able to seek therapy and look back over my life and realise where the threads matched. So,
wow. So are you saying, I just want to pick up on that. You're basically saying that it really manifests itself in a massively negative way, to the point that you need to seek help.
Oh, absolutely.
Not until your 30s.
Not until my 30s. Wow. By which time, I on the outside, it looked like I had a very normal life. I was a teacher. I was married. I had a nice house. Everything looked really normal. But but I didn't really talk about the struggles I'd had as a child. Not to many people at all. I didn't really own it as part of my story. And the rumble started to develop around the time I had my first daughter, my first child. Then people started to come up, as they will eventually. I think, we can't run away from this stuff forever. And so what happened that way, so I ended up going into therapy, learned a hell of a lot, read everything I could, lived a very healthy lifestyle, looked after my anxiety so well. So much so that it became an area that I really wanted to work in. So around 7 or 8 years ago, I left the teaching profession and moved into working with people referral units, where I was working one-to-one kids who were out of education for mental health reasons. I was going into their homes as their English tutor. Also, I received a lot of training with the PRU, also looking at, school avoidance and the impact. I could see the impact it was having on whole families, the financial implications it was having when people had to give up work because their kids were at home and not in school. And so I started working with that area and sort of did what I could to help. Around the same time, I worked in the charity. I started freelancing in the charity where I met you, where we go into schools and help people with their confidence, speaking. But the charity we work for is quite open to you making the workshop your own, isn't it? And a way in which my workshops, because of my background and my awareness and understanding of anxiety by this point, is that I could kind of see a fraction of the class that the workshop kind of maybe wasn't reaching. A lot of it, when we were running these workshops to help with public speaking or interview skills and so on, a lot of our mantra is, you can pretend to be confident. Here's what to do with your body language. Here's what to do with your voice. And this is how you pretend. But there was a bunch of students, up to about a third of a class I'd find. And I just kind of knew this wasn't going to wash. There were too many internal barriers. I sort of knew, because I'd had anxiety myself, I knew the thoughts, the feelings that were going on for these kids. And so I started to develop an element of the workshops where I was giving them anxiety management techniques, just small snippets here and there, sort of being open about my own struggle with anxiety, which kids rarely see from an adult in a school setting. Teachers don't have that capacity really to be able to talk about their mental health. It's too risky in terms of their career, the fact that they're in a school and getting to the wrong ears or to the wrong parents or whatever else. When we go into a school to run a workshop, we're there for one day, I can be open about my own struggles and go again. And I was finding those parts of the workshop were really effective. And in the feedback, the kids were saying that was the part, the parts that helped them most and that kind of thing. And unbeknownst to me, in a way I could never have predicted, this ended up being the work I've ended up doing now with Joe Roundtree, because he was actually doing the same kind of thing in his workshops. He was a guest on your podcast a couple of weeks ago. And he, like me, has had difficult times with anxiety himself,
And what I think a lot of people will find fascinating is, Gen X with that generation who, by the way, today are 61, 62, all the way down to in their late 40s. Their late 40s. Yes, exactly. But the point being is they were the latchkey generation, very self-sufficient, very self-reliant. Yeah. And of course, what's now unraveling is that actually some of this trauma, some of these things that will have affected them. Just before we get on to the younger generations today and specifically about what you're finding in Australia with these mobile phone bans, because that is a whole new debate. We need far more than half an hour. But
it's okay.
Very quickly, where do you stand on this whole thing of analysis leads to paralysis that some people say that sometimes actually do we unpack all of this? Some Gen Xers will have dealt with it, will be resilient to what they went through. Others clearly, like yourself, needed to unpack it, needed to be able to deal with it. Where do you lie on that sort of spectrum, if you like, of how much you go back to your childhood and what happened in your childhood as someone who is seen as a resilient Gen X today?
Well, I'm a huge advocate of therapy. I think, my story kind of makes that kind of obvious. I don't think I'd be where I am today if I hadn't gone back and analysed what needed to be analysed or uprooted what needed to be uprooted. But I was in a position where I had no choice. I think my anxiety and my mental health had become so much so that I wasn't enjoying my life anymore. I was having to take time off work. I was scared of getting anxious again. I was scared of my mental health deteriorating. And so I had to go and do it. I'm in a really good place now. I've done so much work on myself. But if I don't know, if I hadn't had to do it, I don't know if I would have. I can't say. Things couldn't happen any differently because they did.
Yeah, and people can only really frame something from their own perspective.
Yeah.
In terms of what was right for them. And clearly it was absolutely vital that you did it for your own survival, apart from anything else. And, when you're working with youngsters today, where, as you quite rightly say, there is a conversation now, things don't tend to get swept under the carpet like they did when you were growing up. Yeah. Again, that level of unpacking any, if it's mental health, clearly it needs to be addressed. But then, of course, you have this whole thing of, well, teenagers are teenagers as they're going through life stages. They're going through what teenagers go through. And there will be older people who say, well, that's what it is for the majority of these youngsters. It's not actually mental health, severe mental health issues that need to be dealt with. How do you address those kind of comments that might come from your fellow Gen Xers?
I don't think mental health needs to be severe in order to have to deal with it. I think maybe had I dealt with mine sooner, it wouldn't have become so dramatically bad. So I think one of the things we can really learn from Gen X, I think it's a wonderful thing how open they are about their own mental health and how tolerant they are of others. There's less and less stigma these days, and I've by working with young people, I've learned a lot about stigma, because when I open up about my mental health, there's just these nods of understanding, whereas maybe I've been less likely to do it around Gen Xers in the past because there's a recoil from it, and so maybe because I've been immersed in working with young people so long and have developed this aspect of my work, first with the workshops, talk the talk where we used to work together, and now especially with the work I'm doing with Jo with Anxiety Uncovered, we're talking about mental health all the time, and I'm really encouraged by how willing and open young people to talk about it. And it's almost like, I almost think if I'd have had workshops when I was a teenager, like the workshops Jo and I are delivering now, maybe, just maybe, things wouldn't have escalated for me later. Don't know for sure.
And where do you stand on the debate of, we're more aware of mental health and there appears to be more mental health concerns for young people today than there ever has been. Where do you lie in terms of, yes, there is more mental health needing to be addressed, versus actually it's just we know about it more today than we did? How much more genuinely challenging mental health scenarios are arising today because of the era we live in, versus actually it was always there but it just wasn't talked about?
I think it's a lot worse now than it used to be. I remember one workshop in particular I did in Wales, and part of a workshop I do is I sort of talk about what anxiety feels like, and I explain how it feels for me physically and the kind of thoughts I have if I'm in an anxious state. This was a year 7 group, and a third of that class started talking about how they have panic attacks. Now, to me, that's a ridiculous, this is just one class, it's a big survey, but it just seemed, I don't think a third of my class growing up had panic attacks. It seems extreme. The stats are there. A recent survey said, that Jo and I were looking at, stated that 50% of young people over the last year have missed for anxiety reasons, either to do with exam and grade stress, or speaking in class, friendships and fitting in, or appearance. But it's 50% of kids are missing school because of anxiety, but they cite that as the reason.
Wow. And that segues really neatly into what was originally going to be our main topic, but actually this mental health discussion has been, I think, phenomenally useful for people to understand and to contextualize generationally as well. But, you talk about year 7, so we're talking about youngsters who've just gone to secondary school, so they're 11, 12 years old. How much of that do you think is down to mobile phone usage and devices?
I think it's a part of the picture, of course. I think we're all very aware now of the beast that has emerged through social media. That I know from my own kids. When my own kids 7 years ago, asked for a mobile phone, there wasn't the fear around social media that there is now. It was simply a way to keep track of where they were, and maybe they could, have a bit of a laugh with friends. But, over the last 6-7 years, the algorithms have become so aggressive. Things like TikTok, Snapchat have emerged that weren't there before. And suddenly the beast is, uncontrolled. And absolutely, it's a factor for sure. COVID's another factor. I know, a fair number of parents who really struggle to get their kids back to school after COVID. Some have never gone back, a kind of lost generation of kids who, and school attendance is right down as well post-COVID. Too, I forget the numbers, but there's over 100,000 kids in the UK who aren't attending school post-COVID. So
now you're in Australia at the moment, and their lockdown was because I talk in my book about the COVID effect for each generation and where you were in your life stage and which generation you were. That had a direct impact on how you viewed COVID and how it affected your life. And certainly for youngsters, there's no question there was a massive issue, especially during those adolescent years. Australia locked down more severely than the UK. I mean, the UK was pretty strict, but Australia was even more so. Have you noticed any difference because of that in Australia with the short time that you've been there, but with the youngsters you're talking to, the families you're talking to? Is there any distinction you can make between the two?
I wouldn't be able to say. I've only been here a couple of weeks, and I haven't been having those conversations sort of in preparation for this meeting with this podcast with you. I've been talking a lot about the social media ban with parents, so I can give you some insights on that. But in terms
let's get on to that. So let's get on to the social media ban. It's massive news here in the UK. There are, people from all sides of the political divide who are, focusing on it, which is great. But we have everything from it's all down to governance that the authorities need to look at the way social media platforms are being managed and used and the legal ramifications, all the way through to what Australia have done, which is just to ban them outright for, I believe it's under 16. Is that correct?
Under 16s, yeah, or under 16.
So tell us what you've discovered. First of all, what's happened? Are youngsters getting around the ban? Jonathan Haidt, on a recent interview, if anybody is a follower like me of Jonathan Haidt, does amazing work following his book that I particularly read, which was interesting, was The Anxious Generation, one of many books that he's written. But he was saying that youngsters initially started getting around the ban and now less so. Give us a picture of what you're seeing. How's it working? And what's everyone's views on it?
Well, from the people I've spoken to a number of people about it since I've been here. It almost seems like a kind of non-issue in that people sort of feel like things haven't really changed. Now, it's probably best if I explain through telling you about my cousin. So my cousin Amy is the same age as me. She has a daughter who's 15, Llewellyn, and a son who is 10, called Will. And I think her story kind of gives a picture that reflects other stories I've heard. So her daughter is 15 and should be banned from mobile phone use at the moment. However, she, like most of her friends, have circumnavigated it. And it's pretty easy to circumnavigate. So her social media accounts went dead night of the ban. But she was able, all she had to do was change her phone number, get a different phone, and she was off again. Lots of her friends weren't affected by the ban because when they first got mobile phones, maybe back when they were 10 or 11, and the age to go on things like Snapchat or Instagram or whatever was 13, they maybe lied about their age. So the apps just think they're older than they are. Consensus among parents is that for that generation, for kids that age, it's just too late. The damage has been done. It's part of their lives. And because the ban is so easy to circumnavigate, it's pointless to try and enforce it as a parent. The social media companies Snapchat, for example, openly unsupportive of the ban. They released a statement. I was just trying to find it now. I found this statement for this chat. Here it is. Chat, cutting kids off from their friends and family doesn't make them safer or happier. You know, they're not making it that hard for kids to just get a new account and go again. But the parents I speak to think, well, you know, and also they don't want their kids left out. They don't want their kid to be the only kid who doesn't have social media in their year, you know, so it's a really...
And peer pressure's always been an issue, hasn't it? That's really where it all comes from, isn't it? If your mates are on it, you know, yeah.
Yeah, and as a parent, you know, you would worry more about your kid being left out socially. You know, that would be your maybe prime concern, you know. However, she, like many other parents I've spoken to, says the way the kids that will be impacted positively are like kids like her son Will, who is 10. So on the TV at the moment are lots of adverts, you know, kind of aimed at kids. You know, social media is now banned. This is to keep you safe. It's very easy for parents of primary school children to go, no, of course you can't have social media. It's against the law. So it's much, much easier. And because you know, most parents will adhere. You know, most parents don't want their kids on social media. They don't. But, you know, the generation just gone, age 15 or whatever, it's too late. But they're delighted that there's this government support so that we can gradually see a shift and change. The change is not dramatic over here. You know, it's maybe not the big story that we're hearing in the UK. And on the news, there's a bit of propaganda with Albanese sort of saying, you know, 4.9 million accounts have been deactivated. But he doesn't mention how many have been reactivated. From what I can see, it's pretty much like 99% of them. But, you know, it's an interesting thing. When I tell...
So one of the things Jonathan Haidt was saying was that one of the ways that they get around it is having VPNs, which are these networks that you can use. And he was saying the friction was, anecdotally, the friction was too great, so they were giving up. That doesn't sound like that's what you're seeing.
No, I haven't heard any of that, to be honest. The teenagers I've spoken to just say, no, it's changed. And they just find they're always laughing at how easy it is to circumnavigate. But I can sort of see the argument. You know, it is kind of too late. The damage has been done there. You know, and it's too much ingrained in part of their lives, part of their social lives. It is the way they communicate. It's the way they get their news. You know, on the positive side, it's the way they learn a lot of things. You know, as well through YouTube, and that's how they consume news as well.
One of the concerns that people have raised is that youngsters in the future will, if the ban exists, if it continues and it works, and the emerging generations aren't on social media, but then there's a concern that at 15 they suddenly go off a cliff, and they suddenly, you know, they haven't got used to it. They're you know, trying to deal with teenagers and trying to guide them and everything else. You know, it's a little bit too much straight away. It's like jumping straight into the deep end of the pool rather than working your way deeper and deeper and deeper. Is there a viewpoint or a kind of like a thought process of how to deal with that in Australia?
I haven't spoken to anyone about that. There's just this hope for primary school age kids. I've spoken to a couple of parents who've chosen to get their primary school age kids Apple Watches instead, where they can, you know, have a little bit of access to, you know, very limited apps, and parents know where they are and they can keep in touch with a few people. But it's very, you know, very safe, much safer, limited way of using technology. Again, something that wasn't really when my kids accessing social media just wasn't.
So as a parent of Gen Z children, and also being in Australia, having followed this conversation, and we first got in contact probably about a month ago to say, right, we were going to have this conversation. What kind of conclusions have you come up with that might be helpful for kids here in the UK and parents here in the UK when it comes to social media usage, when it comes to the use of their mobile phones?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I have a lot of compassion for parents of kids my age, in that, it feels like we're fighting a losing battle in terms of, it feels like a constant battle against social media. But we know ourselves how addictive phones have become. I have to battle it myself. So I just feel a huge amount of compassion. We all know that this has become a beast that feels almost impossible to contain. And yet we feel kind of helpless when it comes to containing it. Best I've come up with as a parent, and I'm by no means an expert on this or whatever, the best I can come up with as a parent is to share really openly with my kids how addictive I find social media myself. And I ask them to help me put restrictions on apps. I kind of play the fool, and I kind of go, "Oh, Tom, I've been on Instagram for 2 hours. Can you help me just get it, can you put a limit on it for 15 minutes for me because I can't control my addiction," that kind of thing. And I'm trying to teach them ways of kind of self-managing, I guess. Or maybe we'll have conversations around the dinner table where we'll share how many hours we've been on our phones that day. Almost like a kind of walk of shame kind of discussion. Because what we need to do now is kind of advocate for self-management. That's kind of what we want kids to be able to do, what they're going to have to be able to do in the future is manage this very addictive device, and try and put, limit on their own apps, try and find a way to be a little bit ashamed that they were on it for that long. And so I have those conversations around the dinner table with them.
And, the fact that you're having the conversation is great. And I'm, as you know, in the work that we've done and the work that I'm doing now with generations, it's about having that conversation. It's about having the understanding. My concern, I think, is for those families where that conversation isn't happening. For whatever reason, there's a multitude of reasons that I wouldn't go into why those conversations aren't happening. But that's where I feel most concerned, because if there isn't best practice by parents in front of youngsters, it becomes a challenge for those youngsters to develop good habits themselves.
Well, I mean, Australians are just bemused as to why every country isn't putting a ban in place. Because ultimately, although it's had no immediate impact, they can see the impact it's going to have on younger kids. So they just don't understand why other places are stalling. They don't understand why they just don't do it. Like, it's a bit like, what are you waiting for? It's pretty obvious that this is what we need to do to protect the next generation coming through, and it seems pretty obvious to me as well, knowing what we know now about social media. And it's a pretty blunt instrument, this blanket ban. There's probably more sophisticated ways of doing it. But as ever, the conversation is always, why aren't the tech companies doing more? It feels like, because they've abdicated responsibility, falls on parents and then on governments, but really the responsibility really lies with the tech companies, who are just taking any responsibility at all. As we can see, as many parents have tried to, who've tragically lost children, have tried to hold social media companies to account, and just are fighting this battle against that beast.
Emma, we could be talking for 2 hours on this. It's so, but you know what? Not only is it really, just incredible to find out your perspectives, from being, from your background, your challenges with mental health, having 2 Gen Z children, now being in Australia, observing what you've done and working in schools. You've got so much there, and certainly, by the way, I urge anybody who has got youngsters, listen to the Anxiety Uncovered podcast that Joe and Emma have been involved in, because it really helps really put into sharp focus what's happening in schools and what's happening with our youngsters today. Sadly, we are out of time, but what I do want to finish up with, though, is there will be a lot of people listening who either have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, who are navigating this complicated world of increased mental health concern, and also the massive debate over social media and devices and so on. In terms of bringing those generations together, bridging that gap, have you got any sort of pearls of wisdom from all your experience in schools and, life experience that you could share with us?
Well, I'm not sure if this fully addresses your question, but I guess what I've learned when it comes to parenting, dealing with young people, is that often because we're older or we have more experience, we assume we know best, and we assume we can advise and tell young people what to do and solve their problems very quickly. But I found actually that isn't that helpful, and often what is more helpful when it comes to bridging the gap between generations is just asking them what they need. There's a very easy way of remembering it, but I try and make myself remember when I'm speaking to a young person who clearly wants, help, or, wants me to listen. And it's something called the 3 H's. And it sounds a bit contrived, and I don't phrase it this way, but really if I can sense a child wants to talk to me or a young person wants to talk to me, I've got to discern what they need first of all. And the 3 H's are, do you want to be held? Do you want to be helped? Or do you want to be heard? So do you want to be held as do you just need a hug? Do you want to be helped as do you want my advice? Or do you want to be heard, which means do you just want to talk about it? So rather than me jumping in my pearls of wisdom or the way I would have dealt with it, instead I sort of ask them what they need. And often that's a way to bridge communication. Lead by asking. So it's a small little thing, my 3 H's.
I love that. Your 3 H's, that's just absolutely brilliant. And it's not a million miles away from the model I have, the 5 steps to greater intergenerational cohesiveness, which is exactly that. Be curious, listen, then don't judge, don't compare, and just accept we are different. So, actually, good. But you put it really succinctly with the 3 H's. Emma, it's been an absolute joy to see you. Hopefully we'll see you back here in the UK. Well, when the weather's got better, I'll see you back here and we'll get together because you don't live that far away from me, and we can continue the conversation. And actually, I think we need to get you back on here when you come back from Australia, because that will then have a few months of experience and knowledge and conversations. But for the moment, Emma Clark, thank you so much.
That's fine. And a few months down the line, Anxiety Uncovered will have developed even further. I can talk to you more about our work in schools, because it's not just the podcast. We're working in all sorts of educational environments, running workshops, helping young people. So I can talk to you more about that then as well. But I'd love to come back. I'd be happy to. I think
I can feel that return coming. Maybe Joe, the 2 of you together or something. We'll do a 3-way for the first time. We'll see how that goes. And again, in the show notes, we've got Anxiety Uncovered, all the details there for people. They want to follow you and they also want to listen to the podcast. Emma, have a good night there in Australia.
Well, I think I'm going to go for a swim. Swim in the sea. How's that? See you later. Good to see you, Alice.
Love it. Thanks, Emma.
All right.
Okay, bye. And thank you for listening as well to another episode of Alastair Greener, Generationally Speaking. And I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener, Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.